Welcome, I'm Rose Aguilar, and this is Your Calls One Planet series. After Brazil, India is the world's second largest producer of sugar in the world. Coca-Cola and Pepsi have helped turn the Indian state of Maharashtra into a sugar-producing powerhouse. A New York Times and Fuller Project investigation has found that these brands have profited from a brutal system of labor that exploits children and leads to the unnecessary sterilization of women. New York Times reporter Megha Rajagopalan and independent journalist Qadri Inzamam write, young girls are pushed into illegal child marriages so they can work alongside their husbands cutting and gathering sugarcane. Instead of receiving wages, they work to pay off advances from their employers, an arrangement that requires them to pay a fee for the privilege of missing work, even to see a doctor. An extreme yet common consequence of this financial entrapment is hysterectomies. Labor brokers lend money for the sugaries, even to resolve ailments as routine as heavy, painful periods. And the women, most of them uneducated, say they have little choice. Megha Rajagopalan, Qadri Inzamam, and their colleagues traveled across the impoverished district of Bede, which is home to many migrant sugarcane workers. They visited tiny villages and met laborers in their homes. They talked to their employers, visited sugar mills, interviewed doctors, and reviewed medical records. They write, what we found was a brutal system of labor that exploits children, encourages child marriage, keeps families in debt to their employers, and culminates with women feeling they have no choice but to get hysterectomies. It is such a widespread problem that a 2019 government investigation found that of about 82,000 female sugarcane workers in Bede, roughly 1 in 5 had had hysterectomies. A separate, smaller government survey estimated the figure at 1 in 3. So how much of the sugar we consume in the United States comes from this region? Will Coca-Cola and Pepsi be held accountable for exploiting millions of impoverished workers? And how does the supply chain work? Today we're joined by Megha Rajagopalan, an investigative reporter at the New York Times based in London. In 2021, Megha and her colleagues received the Pulitzer Prize in International Reporting for a series of stories on the Chinese government's mass detention and incarceration of Muslim minorities. Hi, Megha. Thank you so much for joining us, and thanks to you and your team for this important investigation.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Well, how did you first learn about all of this?
Well, it's really interesting because when I first heard about this, I was completely shocked that something as serious as hysterectomies or coerced hysterectomies could be linked to like an agriculture or manufacturing process. But in reality, like this had actually been explored within India before we started working on the subject. Like you said, there was a 2019 government investigation into it, which had sparked coverage in some of the local papers. But I think none of the reporting before us had gotten to some of the international buyers and how this connects to the international sugar supply chain. So I started digging into this because I was really curious to answer that question and to see sort of where consumers came into this. So that's sort of how Qadri and I started talking about this story.
This is such an important point because the global supply chain has become so complex and opaque that most of us don't know who's making our products. We try to pay attention to it, but sometimes it's really hard to track. And your piece really highlights the fact that sugar is another example of this.
Yeah, completely. I mean, I've grappled with this question for really a lot of my career. Like I did a lot of work on the apparel industry in China where there are a lot of similar questions. But I mean, the interesting thing about sugar is that it's not like a piece of clothing, right? Where it has like a traceable kind of lineage, because sugar just sort of all gets piled together and like put into bags and then put into products like candy bars and pints of ice cream and bottles of soda and like other things that we buy. So it becomes even harder as a consumer to actually know what you're buying and to sort of trust that these processes are cruelty-free.
And people in the United States are eating more sugar than ever. We mentioned Coca-Cola and Pepsi. You also write about Unilever and General Mills. Can you tell us about other everyday products that people are eating or drinking that has this sugar in it?
Yeah, so I should say that a lot of the sugar that's produced in Maharashtra is actually for for selling within South Asia, particularly within India itself. It's sold by these same multinational brands, but it's not necessarily to consumers in the US. And the reason for that is that in the US, most of the sugar comes from Latin America because it's just closer. But having said that, India is a huge market, and like a lot of the brands that we're familiar with, including Cadbury, General Mills, Hershey, Coke, Pepsi, like all of these brands sell to consumers in India, and they make exactly the same kinds of pledges in terms of responsibility, like social responsibility, that they would to consumers anywhere else. They say that they don't use things like forced labor, for instance, like child labor, like coercive recruitment practices. They have sort of pledged to eradicate all of those practices from their supply chains. So I think it still matters a lot to see how these companies conduct themselves, is particularly in the developing world and in countries that don't have really strong legal frameworks or enforcement around labor rights.
Right, because you write, in practice, these big Western companies seldom, if ever, visit the fields and largely rely on their suppliers, the sugar mill owners, to oversee all of these labor issues.
Yeah, that's sort of what we found. I mean, I sort of, in reporting this, became really interested in this question of like, how do companies actually know? Like, they can assure us, right, in their official documents, and they can reassure their shareholders that their practices are good. But like, how do they, when supply chains are so complex, how do they actually know what's going on in these farms? And it turns out that the answer to that is often that the companies will send somebody that's called a social auditor, who might work for the company, or they might work at a contract or another firm altogether. And they'll send that person for like a few days, maybe once or twice a year, just to sort of check out the factory and maybe visit some farms. In India, it's a smallholder farming system. So what that means is, for one sugar mill, they can source from like thousands of farms, and these are in really remote areas. And it's just like the idea of someone being able to check all of these farms within such a short space of time, to the point where they could really reassure a consumer. It just seems completely impossible. And we also talked to executives that run these sugar mills. They walked us through these processes and how they sometimes go. And what they told us is that the supply chain auditors, they care a lot about things like efficiency, like even things like water efficiency and how the plants run, like how the materials are used, and even care about things like workers' rights within the sugar mills themselves. So whether there are fire exits and things like that. But when it came to the agricultural workers on the farms, who are at that bottom tier of the supply chain and have almost no protections, these sugar mill executives told us that inspectors rarely visit and rarely have opportunities to talk to those people.
As I mentioned in the intro, and I'm learning all of this thanks to your reporting, India is the world's second largest sugar producer, and Maharashtra accounts for about a third of that production. You and your colleagues traveled across the impoverished district of Bede, which is home to many migrant sugarcane workers. So can you tell us more about this part of India?
Yeah, totally. We decided to focus on Maharashtra because, not only because it produces so much sugar, but it's also kind of a rising force in the Indian sugar industry. It's also like, most people that are not from India would know Maharashtra because that's where Bollywood is. Some of the richest people in India live in this state. Politicians, movie stars, musicians, like, big corporate executives live in Mumbai. And the women that we interviewed that cut this sugarcane are only probably about like an 8 to 10 hour drive from Mumbai, but the lives that they lead are just radically different. They live in a part of the state that is really, really dry. Historically, it's been really deprived of rainfall. And though they have irrigation now, it's made it really hard to develop agriculture there. And as a consequence, a lot of the families are really, really poor. Like when you drive down the roads, like one of the first things you notice are there's just like the roads just aren't as good as in other parts of the state because that area is so impoverished. You see a lot of like homes made of corrugated tin, made of other makeshift materials on the sides of the road. You see like tons and tons of fields of cotton, of sugar, and of other crops, like as you drive through. We drove sort of from village to village in this part of the state, kind of in the off season. Sugar is grown in kind of like a 6-month period during the year. So we visited a lot of these women during the period where they weren't working so that they would have time to talk to us. And, what we learned is that every year they migrate, they travel, often on bullock carts, like, basically like carts pulled by bulls, for days to get to these fields where they pick sugar, they cut sugar every day, for a period of 6 months, pretty much without respite. And I guess one thing that surprised me is just like realizing that there are really few people that ever even talk to these women. There's obviously like civil society and like labor workers that are from that region that do engage with them. But in terms of the companies themselves, it seemed like they had really never had contact with these people.
It's so interesting that you mentioned Bollywood, just to think about the massive inequality in this area. And I was wondering, does this get much media attention on the ground? Do these people who have so much money in this area know about what these women are going through? I mean, you wrote this piece with an Indian journalist, Qadri Inzamam, and then you pointed out in your New York Times piece that the Hindu Business Line in 2019 reported on an unusually high number of hysterectomies. So does this issue get much attention in the Indian press?
The thing is, it has gotten attention before, and there have been a number of really good Indian journalists that have dug into this themselves in sort of different ways than we did. The Hindu Business Line being one of them. In response to that article, there was this government commission in 2019 that basically went around and interviewed a lot of these women and asked them specifically about this issue around hysterectomies. And they found, like, as you said earlier, that 1 in 5 women who worked in these sugarcane fields had hysterectomies. And what we found is that a lot of these women are like pretty much like under the age of 40, like many under the age of 35. So it wasn't a situation where they were having hysterectomies, sort of at the usual age where women would be likely to need them, I guess. So obviously that's something that is like very eye-catching. And I think it did get media attention in India. But I think what the thing that really surprised me is that despite the media attention, despite the fact that there was an elected official who chose to dive into it and even produced her own report, there was really nothing done. And that's something that we're sort of continuing to dig into. Within Maharashtra, sugar is obviously a huge industry, and there are tons of politicians in the state who have their own links to the sugar industry, who have their own incentives for sort of not cracking down on these practices. Another thing that I think that's really important to understand is that the way the system works there is that these sugar mills, basically, they employ the agricultural workers in a very indirect way. So what they do is they hire a contractor, and then the contractor then hires the person that actually cuts down the sugar cane. And the reason they do it that way is that if they employed them directly, they would be forced under Indian law to do things like pay minimum wage or pay for benefits or other things that are generally required. So it's not that different, for instance, from like the idea that like your Deliveroo driver is not employed by the restaurant, right? Or like the Uber driver is not necessarily getting benefits from Uber, the company. It's like the same sort of concept. So like that's something that I think is like a thing that protects the sugar mills. It also protects regulators, because regulators can say, well, we don't have to crack down on these businesses because they're not the ones that are employing the workers directly anyway.
Today on Your Call, we are spending the hour with Megha Rajagopalan, an investigative reporter at the New York Times, and we're talking about an investigation she wrote with Qadri Inzamam for the New York Times called The Brutality of Sugar, Debt, Child Marriage, and Hysterectomies. In the piece, we learn that after Brazil, India is the world's second largest producer of sugar in the world. Coca-Cola and Pepsi have helped turn the Indian state of Maharashtra into a sugar-producing powerhouse. The New York Times did this investigation with the Fuller Project, and they found that these brands are profiting from a brutal system of labor that exploits children and leads to the unnecessary sterilization of women. And I hope you can take the time to read this piece. They did such a great job with this piece, and the photos are just really incredible. You can find it at kalw.org, click news, and then Your Call. If you have any questions for Megha Rajagopalan about her reporting, you can give us a call at 866-798-8255. You can also email Your Call at kalw.org. As she reports, most of the sugar that is produced in India is then put in products that are sold in Southeast Asia. Most of the sugar that the United States people in the U.S. eats comes from Latin America, which is very interesting. But as she said, it's so important to know about this, for one, because there's so many abuses here that we need to know about. And also these are major, major brands like Pepsi and Coke. So let's talk about the women that you wrote about. Their stories are just devastating. And really, it's incredible that they told the stories, and then some of the women who've had hysterectomies actually allowed your photographer to take photos of them, and that's in the piece. So let's first talk about the economic incentives that push girls into marriage. You write that in this part of Maharashtra, 2 economic incentives push girls into marriage. And this was so interesting to learn about. Sugar cutting is a 2-person job. So husband and wife teams make twice as much as a man working alone. And this 2-person system is known as, is it koita?
Yeah, that's right.
And that's after the sickle that cuts the sugar cane. So tell us more about that these husband and wife teams make twice as much. And so that's one of the reasons why so many young girls are pushed into marriage.
Yeah, I mean, I thought this was really interesting because obviously child marriage is a problem in a lot of different parts of the world, including India. And it's banned under law, like in India, but it obviously remains a problem in many regions. And I think like before I started reporting this, I had thought about child marriage as kind of, primarily a cultural phenomenon. And it really surprised me to learn that in this part of the country, there's also there are actual economic incentives like created by the dominant industry in the region that push families into this child marriage path. And so basically the way this works is like, when you're cutting sugar, generally speaking, almost always, they cut it in a husband and wife pair. So that's what's called the koita. So the husband will use that sickle to cut down the sugar cane, and his wife will then bundle it and carry it. She also does all of the domestic labor, by the way, which means that, she builds the fire to cook the meals. She does all of the childcare. She does the laundry, and she also carries the sugar for like loading it onto the truck, which they both do. So this is like a team that does it. So for these families, basically when they migrate every year, they take the children with them, and children are also working in these fields, but, even doing sort of, supportive tasks like fetching water from wells all the way to like actual sugarcane cutting. But, children don't get paid for this. They sort of, the pay works by family unit. So generally speaking, it's the husband that gets the pay for everybody in the family that does the work. So what ends up happening is these rural families, they have daughters, and they don't want to continue taking their daughters when they migrate year after year because they cannot collect the money even if their daughters do the work. So they're sort of incentivized to get their daughters married really early so that they don't have to continue migrating with the daughters, and so the daughters can then earn their own money cutting sugar with their husbands. In practice, what ends up happening is these girls are like really, really young when they get married, like even like 12, 13, 14 years old. They have no idea what they're getting into. The women that we interviewed talked about being completely clueless, even about the idea that they would have to then go and cut sugar with their new husbands after getting married. And they end up having no economic power at all, because generally what happens is the contractors that hire them pay the husband directly, and the wives really have no say over the money and like how it's used anyway. I think that it really struck me that a lot of the women we interviewed, like they understood that this was a really bad cycle. And the ones that had daughters talked about how they had dreams for their own daughters who were young or who were sort of entering that preteen age, that they would then go on and do something else, that they would not be trapped in this kind of generational cycle of cutting sugar anymore, and that they wanted to sort of be able to resist the pressure to get them married off, before they were of age. But in a lot of cases, they also felt like they just didn't have the economic means, or that they weren't, really powerful enough to justify supporting their daughters to like complete school, for instance, or like sort of other things that involve like pursuing a path of education or career development, as opposed to, continuing to work in the sugar fields.
That's what I was wondering. Are any of these women able to put their children, especially their daughters, in school?
So a lot of these girls do go to school, but they go to school sort of early, but then they end up dropping out at a certain point. The other issue is that because they migrate to cut the sugar, they're gone like 6 months a year, and there's no safe place to leave them so that they can go to school. The local government has actually worked to set up some hostels for children to live when their parents are cutting the sugar so that they can travel to school. But a lot of these families just don't feel it's safe enough for these girls to stay behind. So they end up dropping out of school, and they just end up without any prospects. I did meet a couple of families that were really trying hard to break this cycle by saving up money, but generally it's a really uphill battle because of the way debt works.
It's devastating. And again, you talked about this, but the longer that children accompany their parents in the fields, the longer the parents must support them. So the families seek to marry off their daughters even in early adolescence. Several women you interviewed recalled being married only months after their first periods. Before the break, we'll just talk about this one example. You begin the piece by introducing us to Archana Ashok Chowdhury, and you write that she has given her entire life to sugar. She was married off to a sugarcane laborer in Western India at about 14. She says too young to have any idea what marriage was. Debt to her employer keeps her in the fields. Last winter, she did what thousands of women are pressured to do when faced with painful periods or routine ailments. She got a hysterectomy and got back to work. How old is she now?
Archana is in her mid-30s now.
Wow. And how did you find Archana?
Well, so we interviewed like dozens of people. Like we were just sort of traveling between from village to village, and like we would talk to whoever was sort of up for talking to us. And I was sort of on the lookout for someone that, we really wanted to feature in the story and really get into depth on what their life is like. And Archana really stood out to me from the first time I met her. She is like not a stringing violet at all. She's an extremely outspoken person. For a woman who was basically forced to drop out of school at like 12 or 13 years of age, like she's very educated. Like you can tell that she has like a strong understanding of like the kind of political and social causes that have led to her family's poverty. And I think because she was so opinionated about it, and also she had such a strong descriptive voice when she talked about her work in the fields and like how that has shaped her life. That's why we really felt strongly that we wanted to write about her story and her family story as well.
Archana said, quote, "It's easy for people to take advantage of us because we have no education. She has spent her life cutting sugar for a mill owned by NSL Sugars." And there's really beautiful photos of Archana in the piece we're discussing today, The Brutality of Sugar, Debt, Child Marriage, and Hysterectomies. You can find it at kalw.org, click news, and then your call. Megha Rajagopalan is an investigative reporter with the New York Times. She and her colleague Qadri Inzamam and the photographers traveled across the impoverished district of Bede in India, which is home to many migrant sugarcane workers. Today, we're talking about their incredible investigation. They also did it with the Fuller Project. This is Your Calls One Planet series. We'll be back after this. This is Your Call. I'm Rose Aguilar. Coming up tomorrow, David Daley will discuss his new book, Anti-Democratic, Inside the Far Right's 50-Year Plot to Control American Elections. On Wednesday, we'll continue our series on Project 2025. We'll be joined again by ProPublica's Andy Kroll. He's out with a new piece called 14 Hours of Never-Before Published Videos from Project 2025's Presidential Administration Academy. We hope you can join us for those shows. If you have a guest idea or a show idea, or you'd like to weigh in on how you'd like us to cover the election, we'd love to hear from you. Your call at kalw.org. Today we're joined by New York Times reporter Megha Rajagopalan. Megha and her colleagues, including independent journalist Qadri Inzamam, wrote an incredible piece for the New York Times called The Brutality of Sugar, Debt, Child Marriage, and Hysterectomies. India is the world's second largest producer of sugar in the world after Brazil. Coke and Pepsi have helped turn the Indian state of Maharashtra into a sugar-producing powerhouse. The New York Times, in collaboration with the Fuller Project, found that these brands profit from a brutal system of labor that exploits children and leads to the unnecessary sterilization of women. And if you have any questions about this investigation, you can give us a call at 866-798-8255. You can also email your call at kalw.org. Before the break, we were talking about Archana Ashok Chowr, the woman that you begin the piece with. And as you say, she is just a powerhouse. In the piece she writes, she speaks 1,000,000 miles an hour. And when she feels particularly passionate, she grabs your wrist to make sure you are listening. She began working in the fields as a preteen, and now in her early 30s, she expects to continue for the rest of her life. So is there no way out for these women?
It's the thing is, I kept trying to answer this question, and I really, in all the time that I spent there, I only really found one person who had actually made it out, whose family was in this like sugar cutting trade. And he was a guy who was like, who became like a professional cricket player. So someone with like exceptional physical talent. But like for a lot of these women, because they don't have a lot of education and because they are sort of wedded, like their destinies are wedded to, what their husbands want. Even when these are arranged marriages that started when both parties were teenagers, they have like very, very limited opportunities to leave. We also interviewed a woman who, basically her dream is to like be a housekeeper, in a neighboring city. And the reason she wants to do that is because when you're a housekeeper, you're not under the sun all day. And in the state, like, in the, like the hottest months of the year, it can be like above, like it can be 103 degrees, 105 degrees. Like it's just unbelievably hot to be working outside all day. And, that's something that she could probably achieve, I think, if she had the ability to move to the neighboring city and, take on work there. But because of the debt that she's trapped in, she's not able to do that. So I think like those factors, like the fact that like the debt keeps rolling, which keeps these women tied to the fields, and also their sort of responsibility to their families, it makes it very, very hard to leave.
Let's talk more about that debt. You write that instead of wages from farm owners, workers receive in advance, often around $1,800 per couple, or roughly $5 a day per person for a 6-month season. This century-old system reduces labor costs for sugar mills. You also report that if they don't harvest enough sugarcane, they accumulate a lot of debt. So can you explain more about how this works?
Yeah, this is really interesting. So I think something that's important to understand is that in this particular part of India, in this system, the landowner that owns the farms doesn't pay the laborers that actually cut the sugarcane. The landowners simply sell the sugarcane that grows on their land. So the reason that's important is that the people that end up paying the sugarcane laborers are actually the sugar mills themselves. So it's like a direct chain. So you have the buyers, the end buyers, who are multinational companies and Indian companies that make things like sweets, sodas, or just sell sugar, like, as a packaged thing at the supermarket. Under that, you have factories. Below that, you have these contractors that the factories hire, and then the contractors then pay the sugarcane cutters like Archana. So basically what happens is these contractors, instead of paying them per hour, like for the amount that they work, at the beginning of the season, will give them like a lump sum. And they do this without any written contract, without any oversight. And the workers themselves, because they haven't gone to school that long, a lot of times they're not even literate. So even if they had a contract, it would be really hard for them to consent in a way that's meaningful. They would probably, if there was a contract, they would probably dip their finger in ink and press it on as a form of signature. So because of this, the way this system is, the contractors then have complete control over how much money they are supposedly paying back and how long that goes. I guess like the contractors would say that it's good that they're giving a lump sum because, if you need to fix the roof on your house or if you have any one-time expense, it's good to have that lump sum. But the negative part of it is that these workers work throughout the season in an effort to pay back the loan. And because there's no documentation of the pay, the contractors are then free to say, well, you still haven't paid it back. You still haven't paid it back. And they roll it over year after year after year. And the workers can't leave. Even if they wanted to leave, they can't. And this is something that we confirmed not only with the workers themselves, but also the contractors. The contractors even admit, like every single contractor that we interviewed admitted to us that it was impossible to get out of this debt system, yet this is still how it works. And when you ask the factories about this, the factories say, well, we didn't set up the system. It's the contractors that do it, even though they're the ones that pay the contractors. So this is the system that makes it really, really hard for women like Archana to go and pursue any other kind of employment, even if they wanted to and even if they had the means to do that.
So who is ultimately responsible for all of this and responsible for the well-being of these workers? Because you write, sugar producers and buyers have known about this abusive system for years.
Yeah, I think the big problem here is that everyone is sort of passing the buck. So the contractors say that they're not responsible. The sugar mills are responsible for the welfare of the workers because the sugar mills ultimately pay the bills. The sugar mills have sort of washed their hands of it and say that it's actually the contractors that are responsible because the contractors are the ones that make the hiring decisions. If you ask government officials say that the problems aren't really that bad, which is not true. They are really that bad. And they say that regulators should clean up any problems that do exist, and that it's enough to have sort of social programs like schools and like building hostels for students, and that a kind of more systemic solution to the problem is not necessary. So they're sort of passing the buck as well. Multinational companies have said publicly that the supply chains in this part of India are so complicated that it produces like real challenges to monitoring. Like Coca-Cola has said this publicly, that they can't see into, I think the words they used were deep agriculture. So even though they promise customers that their products are free of abuses, they also concede that it's incredibly hard to actually make sure that that's the case. And they also don't put in a ton of resources to actually do that. I mean, despite the fact that a lot of these companies, have some of the highest corporate revenues in the world, they only expend a very, very limited amount of money into actually monitoring these supply chains. I think if any of these parties could do things to improve the lives of these workers aren't really asking for a lot. They're asking for things like toilets, like a place to use the bathroom that is secluded and clean, like in the fields. They're asking for things like access to water, which they often don't have in the fields, like a fair payment system, like even like something like contracts, like, and not, those things which are just so basic, are just not given to them. And I guess another thing I should mention that I thought was really stunning is that because of this loan system, workers can't take any time off during the sugar season. They're working 7 days a week in like 100+ degree heat, every single day. And if they want to go and if there's something wrong, like if they want to see a doctor, they have to pay the contractor back to miss work in order to see the doctor. So for a woman, like think about what that means. Like if you're pregnant, you can't even leave to give birth. Like we interviewed women that had given birth in the fields themselves without any medical help at all. So it's really a system where the laborers that are kind of at the base level of the supply chain have been completely abandoned by every party that could have responsibility and has any power to make the situation better.
Well, and to take it back to the women, because it's so important to elevate their voices. Many of us can relate to all of this in terms of irregular periods and pain, but what they have to go through to deal with this. I mean, they have no options. Again, going back to Archana, who is now in her early 30s, she figures she was about 14 on her wedding day. So she had a very heavy kind of ache, like a pull. She had pain in her hip. It pulsed down her leg and never seemed to go away. Her periods were irregular, which she suspected was from working all through her pregnancies, often foregoing food. In the fields, she, like others, sleeps on the ground, spends hours a day hunched over, and carries heavy loads on her head. Tampons and pads are expensive and hard to find, and there's nowhere to dispose of them. And reading about this, Megha, is just, so devastating. Without access to running water, women address their periods in the fields with reused cloth, and they try to wash discreetly by hand.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like when I was writing this, I found it hard to explain like just how tough that really is. Like, I think like anyone who's like, who has a period can relate to this. And I mean, it's really just impossible to imagine like how tough it would be to work in those circumstances, like having your period, and also in a place where it's like pretty, like menstruation is a taboo thing in a lot of parts of India, and this is sort of no exception to that. So I think that's a big part of it, and just also like the story of how Archana ended up getting a hysterectomy when she was like, barely in her 30s, was also something that was really surprising to me. Basically, what happened was she had a lot of pain in her abdomen. Like gynecological problems among this group of women are really common, as you might imagine, because the hygiene conditions in the field are so bad. Of course, you're going to have problems like that. So, I mean, she noticed that she had this pain in her abdomen. She actually was able to get out and go see a doctor. The doctor basically saw that she had a cyst. We know this from her medical reports, and the doctor advised her to have a full hysterectomy. So that includes removing her uterus, her ovaries, and the doctor also removed a fallopian tube. So this is like this is something that is very uncommon, or should be very uncommon in women that are that age, and it's something that has permanent consequences for your life. It can put you into, I think it will put you into menopause early. It can compromise your bone density. It elevates risks of some types of cancer. Like, it's not really a small thing to get a hysterectomy when you're that young. We showed those medical files with her permission to another doctor here in the U.S., at the Yale School of Medicine, who said that there was absolutely no reason that she had to have a hysterectomy. She could have gotten the cyst removed in a much simpler procedure. And this is like a very, very common story among these women. And the other thing that really surprised me about this is how she paid for the hysterectomy. So generally speaking, in India, there are public hospitals, and you should be paying almost nothing, in order to get a procedure like this. But in this part of India, like, because these laborers work in places that are so remote, where there's limited transport and the roads aren't great, they end up going to small private hospitals instead of going to public hospitals, which can be really, really far away and require missing more work and paying more money for the privilege of missing work. So because she had to pay for this hysterectomy, she ended up borrowing money from her employer, basically the contractor that works for the sugar mill that she already owes tons of money to, and who has the power to basically say, you pay back this money through work. So once she got the surgery, she had to contend with this reality that she had put her family in even more debt to that same person that was pressuring her to to come back year after year after year to do this like backbreaking labor. So I think those two things like really stood out to me, and were also like pretty emblematic of what a lot of women go through in these situations.
We're speaking with Megha Rajagopalan, an investigative reporter at the New York Times. She's based in London. We're talking about the investigation she wrote with Qadri Inzamam called The Brutality of Sugar, Debt, Child Marriage, and Hysterectomies. India is the world's second largest producer of sugar in the world after Brazil. Coca-Cola and Pepsi have helped turn the Indian state of Maharashtra into a sugar-producing powerhouse. We have a couple of emails. A lot of people are just saying, what can be done about this? Howard writes, it sounds like slavery. The employer purchases the labor for a lump sum. The accruing debt is even a stronger bond than shackles. Our system, too, locks laborers in by encouraging debt. And then we've got another email from Vicky who says, Coca-Cola exploits Latin America too, but with different horrible local effects. Near the small Mexican city where my sister lives, sugarcane fields have replaced many healthy native crops, and the fields are burned after harvest, polluting the air horribly. The Coca-Cola plant is a major local employer, but the hours and wages are brutal. Worst, perhaps, are the extremely high rates of obesity, diabetes, and asthma in the entire local population. Efforts to organize or even advise local workers have resulted in murders. Thank you, Vicky. I mean, since Megha told us that most of the sugar being produced in India is going to Southeast Asia, but it's the same Western companies that sell these products around the globe. Most of the sugar that we eat in the United States comes from Latin America, so we'll definitely do a follow-up. Are you planning to do any pieces about that, Megha, about sugar in Latin America?
So we're definitely still following this project. I think primarily I'm looking at India still, but I would really love to hear from Vicky or anybody else who's listening who wants to talk about how this industry functions in other parts of the world, especially Latin America, because it is such a big industry there. And I guess from what I've heard, a lot of very similar abusive practices are used there as well. So it doesn't surprise me. I guess I also just wanted to add that after we published our piece, I got lots of email from readers asking what can I do? And I guess I've thought about that question a lot too. And I guess for me, this isn't just about sugar. It's about, bigger question of, as consumers, how can we be more conscious about what we're buying? And I think a big part of the answer to that is to really try and buy from companies that are more transparent and really, have a really high standard for that. Just because a company says oh, we checked out this factory and everything was fine, that's not enough. We should be asking companies to tell us a lot more about where they source the products that they're selling to us. And also in terms of regulators, I mean, the U.S. has a pretty good law in the book banning the import of goods from made with forced labor. I think the enforcement of that, can sometimes be patchy depending on what product we're talking about. I think advocating for laws like that, for good enforcement of laws like that, can go a really, really long way towards, affecting people that do this kind of work in other parts of the world.
Right. And we're going to talk about this certification program in a minute, but I just wanted to mention one more example because we really need to know about what these women are dealing with. You also write about another woman, Megha Govardhan-Bole, who's been working in the field since her child marriage about a year after her first period. She's in her 30s. You write, season after season, the weight can break down the discs in your neck, leaving a constant stiffness. If you ask doctors in the region what happens to the bodies of women in the sugar fields, this is the injury they mention. More relentless, though, is the punishment of field life. The workday ends at midnight. when trucks have hauled away the last of the day's crop. So midnight, women sleep under tarpaulin tents with their families on thin mats cast onto the ground. They wake as early as 4 a.m. to fetch water, build a fire, boil tea, and cook lentils and vegetables. And then they do the wash, and then they're back to work. So they get about 4 hours of sleep?
During the sugar season, yeah, that's like quite often the case. That's sort of what they described to me, and that's what our photographer went and stayed with them while they were working with one of these families while they were working in the fields. And yeah, that's she saw all of this happen. It's like it's almost impossible to conceive like how hard they actually work.
I mean, those of us who get barely 6 hours of sleep, I mean, it's hard to function. And then they have families, they have to cook and they have to clean and deal with this grueling work and then possibly with a hysterectomy.
Yeah. And like, you know, what's sad about it is that there's so like the amount of money that it would take to improve someone's life that's in this situation is just so little to us. And for them, it would be really life-changing. And I do think like, you know, it's not, I don't think you can solve this just by giving money to individuals, although of course that would help those people. But I do think like changing the system in some way to account for that so that there's a little bit more of a reward on the bottom end of the supply chain and not so much reward taking, you know, towards the top could make a really big impact.
You know, the way that the world works today with social media and the celebrity culture that we live in, it's a silly question, Megha, but I have to ask, what if someone extremely wealthy in India who's a star took on an issue like this? I mean, at this point, because as you write in your other piece about labor, so in the 1990s, people began raising awareness about all of the brutality around the Gap, for example. I mean, we've had so many stories about this, and yet it doesn't seem to change. Do you think it would take like a major celebrity to take on an issue like this? Do you think that would do it?
I think those things can definitely help. I mean, I guess like I spent a lot of time working on China, and I know like a lot of like the issues in Tibet, for instance, the fact that celebrities champion them, it really made them into big international issues. I worked on labor abuses in Xinjiang. That's another issue where celebrities, like some celebrities have spoken up about it. And I know that it has brought a lot of attention to it. I think like any attention at all could be positive. I guess like in terms of your broader question and like, why does it seem like nothing's changed? I do think it's important that we all like remain somewhat optimistic about it. I don't think it's true that nothing has changed. I feel like a lot of industries that have been called out, you know, they have, pretty much been forced to put additional resources into monitoring for labor abuses and being more transparent with consumers. And that is a completely positive thing. It's positive for the companies too, because it levels a playing field for them. In the EU, now they're working on the implementation of new rules that are, I think some of the strongest in the world that, would require companies to, proactively monitor their supply chains for environmental and labor abuses, and would also give victims of these kinds of abuses the ability to litigate in European courts. There's still a lot of questions on implementation, but I think like, you know, as societies, like we're moving in the direction of more oversight. I think like for us as consumers, like myself included, it can seem like painfully slow, but I think that's why it's really important to like keep advocating and voting with our feet and keep paying attention.
And we have just a few minutes left, but there are all of these certification programs. People look for labels and things like that. Can you quickly tell us about the nonprofit PepsiCo, which certifies farms and sugar mills as being free of labor and environmental abuses? What did you find?
So PepsiCo is a group that accounts among its membership a lot of major companies, including General Mills, Unilever, Coca-Cola, Pepsi. They also have NGOs like WWF is one. And basically, a big thing that they do is that they certify sugarcane. So what they aim to do is like they'll send an inspector called a social auditor into a sugar mill, and like also they'll send them to farms, and they'll basically issue like a certification of the mill saying that this mill produces clean sugar, or a certificate that says, well, this mill has a supply chain that is completely clean, right? Clean of environmental abuses and labor abuses. And they have like a written set of standards that their auditors audit these that check these like mills and farms based on. So what we found in Maharashtra is that Bonsucro had given this certification to a mill that had laborers that were suffering all of the abuses that we have talked about in the last hour. And we found that there was another mill that Bonsucro auditors had visited, and that mill told us that they were on track to certification and that they were expecting to get it. So I guess like the reason that I chose to write about this is it raises these certification schemes are used not just by sugar, but like by pretty much every industry, like anything that you might buy, like things like palm oil, like, and cocoa and coffee. So like commodities like that, all the way to things like apparel, like goods made with plastic. Like every industry has a certification scheme like this, and they use these schemes to reassure consumers about purchasing their products. And it sounds like a good thing because any oversight is better than no oversight. But in practice, like what can happen is that they end up certifying things that should never have been certified in the first place. So obviously that's something that can send a false message to consumers. And that's something that we found here. And I think the reason that they're doing that, it's not because Bonsucro is like run by bad people. It's more just like the tactics that they use in order to do these certifications. It provides them very, very limited visibility into any of these problems. And they are also, they get like these auditors, they're paid for by the sugar mills that are the subjects of the audits. So there are like incentives there that are probably sort of going the wrong way.
Megha Rajagopalan is an investigative reporter at the New York Times. She's based in London. We've been talking about this incredible investigation, the brutality of sugar, debt, child marriage, and hysterectomies. You can find the piece at kalw.org. Click News and Your Call. Megha, thanks so much to you and your team for this great investigation. Thank you for joining us. We'd love to have you back to do a follow-up.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thanks to Malihe Razazan for producing today's show. Thanks to Kevin Vance for engineering our show. And thank you for joining us. I'm Rose Aguilar. It's Your Call.